All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rajman Rai. I'm a faculty member here at HMS in the Department of Biomedical Informatics, and I am thrilled to be co-organizing this meeting with Zach. This is the 10th anniversary of the conference, and we are going to shake things up with a first ever event at this meeting, which is a formal debate. The topic is, should GPT-4 write my thesis? And I think it's fair to say that when we started planning these meetings, this would have been complete science fiction to even be having an event like this. In one corner, we have Professor Zach Kohani, and the other is Professor Peter Solovitz, who happens to be Zach's PhD advisor for his 1987 thesis, Temporal Reasoning in Medical Expert Systems. And so 4 years ago, Zach asked me to start co-organizing these meetings, and it's all come to this moment where Zach is publicly debating his PhD advisor, who happens to be my own former PhD chair a few years ago. We're very thrilled to have a Harvard College sophomore and Harvard College debate union member. She travels with the team, goes to Oxford and Princeton to debate on behalf of Harvard, Ambika Grover as our moderator. She'll be keeping our distinguished professors in check and making sure the debate doesn't end up in a strange loop. Ambika will explain the rules and the format shortly. Ambika, Zach, and Pete, the floor is all yours.
Good morning, everyone. Before I begin, can I say I'm very excited to be moderating the most exciting debate of the day. And yes, this includes the vice presidential debate happening later this evening. So shortly behind me on screen, you'll see a QR code that comes up. We are making this debate very interactive. So you, the audience yourselves, will be deciding who the winner is at the end of this. So go ahead and scan that QR code, and you will be asked the question, should GPT-4 write my thesis? Before we begin, I want to talk about the format of today's debate. So the format is largely going to resemble that of a collegiate debate activity. We'll start with each speaker giving their 5-minute opening statement, beginning with the speaker for and then against. We'll move into then cross-examination, where each speaker will be grilled by their opponent for 5 minutes each. We'll then move into rebuttal, the part of debate where we are working to respond to our opponent's arguments, with each speaker also having 4 minutes. Then the floor is yours. For 5 minutes, we'll have audience Q&A, both from our in-person participants as well as those who are online. And we'll close out with closing arguments, 3 minutes each. And at the end of this debate, we will be determining the winner based on your vote, how much the speakers have persuaded you on whether GPT-4 should be used to write your thesis. Now, another component of this activity is that collegiate debate is quite fun. We do not just give speeches in silence. So I'm going to encourage our audience to participate in many ways. First, if you hear something that you largely agree with, something amusing, an excellent point, I would urge you to shout a lively "hear, hear" in the audience in support of that point.
Hear, hear.
Exactly, thank you. If you also hear something that you believe should get some attention, I'd encourage you to lightly rap on the nearest surface, sort of like this, in support of the point a speaker is making. And unfortunately, we don't have the ability to mute the microphones of our speakers like in the presidential debate. So if our speakers do go over time, I will start banging on the table, and the whole audience, I need your support to silence our speakers if they go over that time period. So with that, I am pleased to introduce our debaters. Debating for, we have Dr. Zach Kohani, and then against, we have Peter Solovitz. And I suppose the real question is, will Zach have his PhD revoked? With that, I'd like to call this house to order, and I invite the first speaker on proposition, or the for side, to open the debate for their side of the house. Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
Yes, so I do understand when I took this on that I could just be completely destroyed by Peter saying, no, it should not be used for your thesis, but for you, Zach, you should have used it for your thesis. So why might you agree that GPT-4 should write your thesis? Here are, very quickly, 3 points. First of all, 1, writing of a thesis has become a misshapen and toxic ritual, divorced from its intellectual and historical roots and pedagogical goals. What are those roots? It goes back further, but the modern version is a German version that started in Humboldt, Berlin in the late 18th and 19th century with profound impact on the modern concept of a PhD. And it was typically 20 to 50 pages long, but it could be as brief as 10 to 15 pages. For example, Albert Einstein's PhD thesis at the University of Zurich in 1905, a new determination of molecular dimensions, mere 24 pages long. It emphasized depth over breadth, strong emphasis on theoretical foundations, less focus on practical applications, preparing the candidate for academic disputations, written primarily for other scholars in the field, less concern for accessibility to broader audiences. The US model has modified that to make it more incremental, perhaps less breakthrough, less theoretical, more structured with publications. And now I'll give you the litany of the problems entailed in practice by the US model. These theses dissertations are often unnecessarily long and complex, over 100 pages. It creates increasing time to complete PhDs, partly due to dissertation requirements. Traditional theses delay publication, delay, therefore, the advancement of science. And it doesn't take advantage of new publication formats. Publishing on paper now is not the only way of communicating science. And let's recognize that not everybody is a great writer, and waiting until your PhD thesis to develop writing skills is probably the wrong move. You may not know that half of all doctoral degree earners will go on not to academia, but to industry. And the thesis dissertation as currently done does not well represent the work product that we need in industry. And the relevance of the PhD has declined. It started low, but it's even gone lower. Less than, I think, 0.2% of all publications reference PhD theses. And most sadly, half of all doctoral students leave graduate school without finishing their doctoral program, and at least 60% of those, so 30% of the total, it's during the thesis writing that they drop out. The pressure of writing a thesis can contribute to mental health issues among doctoral students, and isolation during the writing process can exacerbate these problems. Apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? So, point number 2, having GPT-4 write your thesis, but not do your research, and engaging you in their course of the AI writing the thesis as an adjunct or extender of your thesis advisor directly leads to better education, better research, better growth, and increased value to society. Creating a conversation embodied, so there's a conversation embodied as a text that the AI is writing that includes your scientific process, your results, and your published papers is going to help you enormously. Identifying unique, unifying themes in papers bundled together, creating a collaborative process, a sounding board that doesn't wait until your next meeting with your thesis advisor, happening every day. Identifying weaknesses in your argument in your thesis from the start so you don't waste experimental time or writing time. And with all that time that is left over for at least 6 months of writing, so many more things can be done. You can use this time to do presentations for job talks, create summaries for other audiences. You can have adversarial debates again and again with colleagues. And you can be confident that you are now part of a trend that, as led by the original people, Germany, you only have to publish your papers. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank that speaker for their eloquent remarks, and now I invite the opposition to open the debate for their side of the House. Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
Here, here.
I'm delighted to participate and to cross swords with Zach, one of my spectacularly successful graduate students, former graduate students. When I saw the topic of this debate, I was a little confused because I don't know what it means to have ChatGPT write my thesis. For example, does it mean I push a button, it formulates a research problem, designs the plan, carries it out, does the literature review, and writes the entire thesis, and my contribution was to push the button? That would be at one extreme. At the other is the idea that, just as we heard in the previous panel, tools like GPT or LLMs in general can be used to help clarify ideas, to learn specific things, and so on. That's a much more mild ambition. So I started thinking about what is a thesis for? Nowadays, as Zach was saying, people typically write papers before they write a thesis. In my day, I wrote my thesis and then wrote papers based on what was in the thesis, but that's pretty passé nowadays. So one of the things the thesis is for is that papers tend to be short. And in the course of doing the research for them, it's very common that things go wrong. And people change their minds, they develop new ideas, they develop new engineering techniques to make it possible to carry out the work that they wanted to do. Those typically don't wind up in the papers, but the thesis provides an opportunity to go into detail on those things and to leave a trail for successors in the field to say, oh, this was not a good idea. I had one student decades ago where he had essentially a thesis based on negative results, and one of his committee members said, "You've done us a great favor because you've erected a giant sign that says, 'Don't come this way.'" And that's an important part of what a thesis can do. So I think the idea that, for example, you take the handful of papers, and instead of the students synthesizing and expanding on them, you ask GPT to do so, you can probably get a decent summary of those papers, but you're not going to get this additional flavor that I was just describing. Now, a second role of the thesis is to demonstrate the candidate's abilities in order to justify awarding a degree. And to the extent that the LLM is doing a lot of that work, it fails to justify the awarding of the degree to the student. So, for example, how would an LLM formulate a problem or help formulate a problem? That's the creative step that is often the first important thing that a student has to do. And in order to do that, or the quality of having done that, is a large argument in favor of their getting their degree. They've been able to identify an important problem, and therefore they're probably likely to be able to do so in the future. Evaluating the state of the art and its weaknesses, that's something that an LLM might be able to do by reading all the literature and synthesizing it, unless it hallucinates crap and misses things that are important, which empirically does happen, of course. Design a research plan. How do you go from the problem formulation to how to solve it? Again, we're looking for the creativity of the student to be able to come up with ideas to do that. The LLM, at best, can synthesize ideas from other people's creativity and maybe plagiarize methods that they have used. You have to carry out the plan, present and explain the results obtained, draw conclusions from those results and relate these back to the formulated problem, and write in an organized, persuasive, and informative way. These are all skills we value in a student's abilities. And I think a GPT-written thesis doesn't satisfy most of these requirements. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their fine remarks as well. And now we are moving into the cross-examination portion of this debate. So to begin, Zach will be cross-examining Pete. You're welcome to ask questions and Pete will be asked to respond. You're also welcome to ask follow-up questions so long as the speaker has the appropriate amount of time and space to respond. So with that, we'll move into our first period of cross-examination of 5 minutes. And Zach, whenever you're ready, you may ask the first question.
All right, thank you very much, and I'll count on you to tell me when I can stop. Thank you. So, first of all, as in general, when we talk about AI, I think it's important to ask ourselves, what is the state of the art today, as opposed to what we like to imagine it to be? And I can say that Pete Solvich is such a remarkable mentor and professor that he can get all too easily deluded about the actual state of the role of the thesis in the role of the development of the student. And I'd like to provide here to my esteemed mentor some questions to involve some reality testing. Pete, have you ever seen a thesis where you said to yourself, they kind of missed it, but they've been there for 10 years, and, let them go?
Yeah, of course that happens, but it's pretty rare, actually. I was on the committee of a student where his chairman at the defense said, well, let's pass him if he promises never to talk about it. But that's a singleton example of something that horrible. And I've been a supervisor for 40-something theses and have been on another 100 committees or something. And fortunately, this is very rare.
That's nice, Pete. 40 theses. There's 40,000 students a year getting their PhD thesis. I'm glad to see you have such a broad perspective on them. So, Pete, do you think that on average, these professors are engaging these students actively throughout that 6-month period where they're writing the thesis and pointing out to them, maybe this argument can be stronger. Can you think of a way that that argument could be stronger? Oh, I think this is a logical error. Would you consider that logical error? How about this writer? You haven't actually referred to their work at all. Maybe you should include it. And by the way, what does this mean for the future? Can you actually tell me what the next experiment would be? Do you think this is common or uncommon?
Well, I like to think that I do that.
Yes, you do. Then again, I'm an expert in rare diseases.
He has better jokes. That's certainly the ideal. And I think not everybody lives up to the ideal, but that's what we try to do as research supervisors, thesis advisors in academia everywhere. So I don't accept the argument that just because not everybody lives up to those standards, we should throw over the system and get that sort of tutelage from a large language model. My experience with large language models, as Zach knows, because he asked me to write an opinion piece for his new journal, the first time one of my TAs asked it to generate a synopsis of my career, it ended by lamenting my death in 2018. So, you know, with that level of verisimilitude, I worry about what might happen to a thesis where a language model is in fact making suggestions like that.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more quick question.
Great. So you see, unlike the average thesis advisor, we do know that GPT and its kin are getting smarter and smarter. So we can actually expect that performance to improve. And so, Pete, as you look into the future for the Pete Solges, the exceptions of the future, do you think they're not going to be engaging in an active conversation with AIs, critiquing their work, and that critique becomes a written document that is the lifeless residue of an important conversation that they had with the AI and with their professor?
No, I think students will use generative models to generate text, to generate figures, to generate all sorts of stuff. And I think mostly that can be helpful if it doesn't distort the meaning of what they're trying to convey. The one residual concern I have about the effect of that is that these models are trained on what exists in the literature. And so I'm concerned about homogenizing the output of PhD theses if you do that, because the stuff that the LLM recommends or generates is going to be a reflection of what other people have done before. And it's kind of counter to creativity, I think. You know, a really good thesis develops sort of a brand name idea where the student comes up with a new way of looking at things and a new way of describing things that lends insight to a lot of their compatriots. And I think that's less likely to come from the sort of, you know, let's correct this argument because it's a non sequitur, or let's fix the grammar of the sentence type of intervention.
Wonderful. Thank you both speakers for our first excellent round of cross-examination. And now it is time to switch roles. So now I would like to invite Pete to question Zach for the next 5 minutes in the same fashion.
So Zach, my main question as I was thinking about this problem is how do you make this actually work, right? So clearly, I don't think you're an advocate of the push the button and it goes off and does it all on its own view. So it's something between that and just being a good grammar checker. Now, these LLMs are trained on, you know, all of PubMed and all of Wikipedia and all of a whole bunch of other stuff. But what do they know specifically about your research? So for example, if you wanted to write something about a great idea you had that didn't work out and caused you to change your mind and develop something else, where would this model get that information?
So I anticipated that you would ask me that question, and
Because I told you I would.
thank for nothing. And so I quickly asked myself, how can I respond to that? The problem is, Pete's identifying true weaknesses in the current models like GPT-4. And so I could claim GPT-6 will solve these problems, but that would not be particularly convincing. So instead—
Well, you'd have to tell me how.
Yes. So instead, what I did is as following. I said, let's take an example of someone who's written 3 papers, as they currently do. And let's say, what conversation can the student have with them that will lead to a PhD thesis? And so I hope you'll appreciate the irony when I'll tell you that I took 3 papers that Pete published in 2024 and 2023. 3 papers. And wonderful papers, which I can recommend. I don't have time to tell you chapter and verse. And I gave them to GPT-4, and I had an extensive conversation with this, at the end of which it provided a document describing our conversation, which is a 3,000-word, 6-page outline for a thesis, including some wonderful comments, which I might actually give to you. But it prompted me, as the mini Solovich, some books that it thought I should read that it thought I had not read based on the writing of the 3 papers, such as Prediction Machines, The Simple Economics of Artificial Intelligence, or The Ethical Algorithm, The Science of Socially Aware Algorithm Design. It also suggested, can I think about research to follow? And I was a little bit confused, and it said, how about something like comparative performance of AI-assisted versus traditional clinical decision-making in complex hematological disorders? And it says, and I said, well, how am I going to find some patients? And it said, how about a set of 50 complex cases? And I said, I'm not a doctor, I don't know how to. And it says, here's a case. A 45-year-old woman presents with fatigue, shortness of breath, and pale skin, her initial CBC, and it goes on. And it says, why don't we run the study? And it describes the after I push it, and I say, well, I don't understand, and it actually has the conversation with me. I then, it says, have you had talked with any collaborators about this? I said, I don't know. Who are the collaborators that in Boston that I should talk to, as mini Peter Solovich? He says, well, I recommend Dr. Regina Bartzelay at MIT. I said, that's a good suggestion. And I was pleased to see it said, and you should collaborate with Isaac Kohane. I kid you not. And I said, can you identify weaknesses in my thesis? And it did. And I can tell you, chapter and verse, all the weaknesses it identified, and we had a conversation about ways we could expand the thesis. And amazingly, having read Pete's 3 papers, as an MIT professor, you'll appreciate that this is the way it concluded its thesis. In conclusion, the potential of AI in healthcare is as vast as the universe and just as mysterious. As we continue to explore this frontier, let us remember the words of William F. Buckley. I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston telephone directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University. Perhaps the same could be said for AI in healthcare, but let's not test that theory just now.
Well, that's a lot to try to answer. So what you're telling me is that it's able to generate this short synopsis of 3 of my papers by reading the papers, by its background knowledge, and by an extensive conversation with somebody who knows my work very well. Okay?
I had not read those 3 papers prior.
Okay.
I know your prior work extremely well, but not those 3 papers.
Okay.
They're actually damn good, and I didn't know you were getting into reflex testing and this ethics stuff. You?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. It's a broad field.
It's a broad field.
It's as broad as the stars or something.
Yes. But I did not know this part of your work.
Okay.
But I was general purpose intelligence, I hope. Sorry.
But so part of the answer to my question about how you make this real is you say, well, let's combine what the model knows in general with an extensive conversation with you. Now, in order to have that extensive conversation, isn't it the case that you have to have done the work? In other words, how do you form your opinion about ethics or about reflex testing or something? You have to have a lot of experience doing it.
Well, it certainly relied on you having written those papers.
Yeah.
And so presumably, remember, we're not saying that it should do the research. So you really are Pete Solovich. You really wrote those 3 papers. You know a heck of a lot of it. But not only do you not know what a bunch of stuff, but you also don't know what you don't know. even in just what humanity knows.
Yeah.
I would read in a different debate, I'd like to argue that these things can, and I know this is a place where we disagree, that these things can actually interpolate beyond what we know, but that's a different discussion.
That is a different discussion.
All right.
Yeah.
So, by the way, I do know Regina and those various people that were mentioned in this, and I talk to them all the time. So it's not that I omitted doing that. I may not have cited them in those particular papers. Also,
CYA.
Where do you get patient data? Well, Jeff Drazen was kind enough to give us access to the New England Journal case reports, which we used in, I don't know which papers were the three that you read, but we've certainly used those with some work with Travis Zach at UCSF in trying to understand how these language models work. And what we find is that they're remarkable, but they have flaws. For example, they vastly overrepresent the majority ethnic composition and gender composition of patients suffering from particular diseases, where the real prevalence is only perhaps a slight majority. And what we found is that, you get 90% or 99% predictions that it's somebody of this ethnicity and that gender. So they can be misleading as well as helpful. And I don't deny that they can be helpful, but I just am very nervous about relying on them in any significant way.
All right, thank you both speakers for a very spirited conversation. We're now moving into the rebuttal portion of this debate. So while we've already had a lot of points in contention, now it's time for each speaker to retain the floor for 4 minutes each and directly respond to all of their claims that the opponent has made. So we'll begin with Zach with 4 minutes whenever you're ready.
So again, I come back to, we need to have the doctoral education that we want rather than one that we have. And too often we refer to the idealized portion that we have. So the Socratic challenging dialogue that was pithily summarized in 20-page theses in the German model that was also like the early American model, that is no longer the case. And so what we do see, and I do see, and Pete sees, not necessarily our own students, is students lost in an isolated penumbra where they're trying to scrabble fast so that they can graduate in the next year, write up everything they did, hope that their thesis committee agrees to it, do this incredible amount of effort, which actually detracts from thinking critically, from thinking, what is the problem I'm asking? And to actually, the pressure of having to write that thesis disincentivizes you from asking hard questions of yourself. Karl Popper said the essence of science was to, from the outset, know that you are wrong and be among the first to try to figure out how you are wrong. And so if the work product is a long document that has to be not 20 pages, but 100 pages, that has to be approved by everybody, you are disincented from being able to ask yourself, what's wrong? What are the next steps? And I think what is happening is a profoundly anti-intellectual phenomenon in American education around our doctoral thesis. And if we look at these agents, imperfect as they are, and getting better every day, as a dialoguer that can take our brilliant professors, even those who are not great pedagogues, who are not great mentors, and have a great conversation that extends the brilliance and insight of these professors, but provides the personalized care and feeding and conversation that students thrive on, I think if we do that, we will see a reflorescence of science and intellectual thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Pete to respond with 4 minutes of time, whenever you're ready.
Hi. Perhaps we don't disagree as profoundly as the debate topic might suggest. So I have to make a confession. My first PhD student in 1979, I think, wrote an 860-page PhD thesis.
That's an ICD-9 diagnosis. DSM-5 diagnosis.
I was a young and naive thesis advisor, and I didn't know how to stop him. I used to joke with him that he didn't realize that there was a delete key on the keyboard. And so he would write something, and then if it turned out to be wrong, he would write more stuff to explain why it was wrong rather than... Now, it turns out it was a monumentally interesting thesis and made him famous. He became a professor at Stanford. He became a philosophy professor of all things, and then eventually a dean at the University of Toronto. So it didn't turn out badly for him, but I felt bad about it, and I've certainly never had students do that again. So if you could use a tool like an LLM to read that 860-page thesis and say, hey, you could have said the same thing in 300 pages, that would have been an improvement. So I don't disagree with that. But the things I said before still make me concerned about turning over large chunks of the task to a large language model, because it just doesn't know what it is that you're actually trying to convey. And so I think there's a risk of plagiarism, because it might come up with wonderful arguments that come from what other people have said, but that are not original to you. I can't remember who the author was, but somebody said that they don't know what they think about something until they write it down. And I think the process of going from a kind of inchoate understanding of what the experiment was that you proposed or that you did, and describing it in a concise way is a really important part of research and of certifying your ability as a researcher. So I'm quite nervous about outsourcing that to a model that doesn't have insight. Now, if we look at GPT-16, maybe it'll come with a helmet that does EEG interpretation and understands your deepest thoughts and can do this on its own, but I don't think that's what we're talking about. That's definitely not the state of the art. So my argument is simply that although these tools are useful, students now talk to their advisors, they talk to their committee members, they talk to their colleagues, other students, they go to conferences, they talk to other people in the field. This is potentially useful additional input into their thought process, but not something that would justify the title of this debate, which is you should have GPT write your thesis for you. That's just too extreme.
Thank you very much for those rebuttal remarks. Now we're going to move into the audience question portion of this debate. So I'd invite in-person audience members if they'd like to come to the mic. And if you're online, please feel free to type a question in the YouTube live stream chat, and we'll call upon you. So you can ask the question, and then I will direct it to our speakers to answer. Would you like to start?
Sure. Hello, I'm a fourth-year medical student at Brown, and applying into neurology, was a former software engineer at a computer vision company. So my question is, right now, LLMs are designed to predict the next word output and, in certain instances, the next frame or next imaging output, but they fundamentally lack in multimodal capabilities for labeling and recognizing images and other sorts of data, EEG, for example, and all of those different forms of data would go into the process of writing a thesis in most fields. So are we being disingenuous when we're saying that in the current moment right now, an LLM can indeed synthesize most of the thought process and information to generate a thesis?
Why don't we have Zach and then Pete answer?
Okay, so I anticipated, I've had that question come up before, and so I did the following experiment. I took a picture that the world had never seen because it was published as a challenge in the New England Journal of Medicine for doctors, and most doctors failed this challenge miserably. It showed the picture of a back of a 72-year-old man who had a 2-day history of being extremely itchy, and the picture was just their back and had a lot of sort of linear marks on them. And so I looked at it and said, maybe they're scratching themselves. I don't know what these marks are. And I gave the whole history that doctors had, but I removed one essential piece of information from that description. And GPT-4 said, this could be a bleomycin toxicity, a chemotherapy drug, which it was not. And its next choice was, this could be shiitake mushroom dermatitis, which I had never heard of. But just to make it hard, I removed the mention that the New England Journal had included of the person had eaten shiitake mushrooms the day before the symptoms. And so right now, I can tell you there are many foundation models in medicine that can not only diagnose the pathology slide, can point out where the cancer cells are, can actually say, here's the transcriptomic signature, I believe, of those cancer cells. And by the way, here is the prediction of mortality of a patient with a slide like that. One of our faculty, Kun Sing Lu, just published that in Nature 2 weeks ago.
So I'm not going to talk about shiitake mushrooms, although they're delicious. But one thing you said really struck me as being correct and insightful, which is that nobody understands why these models are able to do the things that they're able to do. This was the point of that opinion piece that I wrote in Zach's journal. Is if you had told me a few years ago that by training a model to predict the next word in some vast corpus, I could get it to intelligently answer questions, to follow instructions, to generate output in particular specified formats, I would have said you're smoking something, because it's just not possible. And we still don't understand. And I talk to a lot of my theorist colleagues at MIT, and I say, why does this damn thing work? And they don't know. Nobody knows. Sam Altman is on record as saying he has no idea why it works. It just works. And so we're treating something that's an engineering artifact as if it were some natural phenomenon. We don't understand how all of biology works, but that's because there are no design specs. But for this, we can read the code. Well, we could if OpenAI were actually open, which it's not. But in principle, we could read the code, but it doesn't help us figure out how it works. And so I'm very nervous about relying on tools that we fundamentally don't understand.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, next question.
Yeah. Pretty years ago, I'm a computational biologist and also working in AI governance. And well, to answer your comment, Peter, could be that, we separate semantics from syntax, right? So if you think about, what's the next word given that all the previous words, it's really strange that ChatGPT is so successful. But if in the structure of the syntax, the semantics is there, and this semantics and syntax is, projected in this embedding space that, LLM use, maybe it's not that surprising. So this is maybe one way to think.
That's a comment, that's not a question.
Yeah. So the question is, okay, that was a comment, but it's not a comment, but I noticed that both of you seem to disagree, but you don't disagree so much in the sense that actually Zach is very optimistic and saying, okay, there's a lot of cores, when you do a PhD thesis, which takes much time and actually reduces your imagination and your creativity because you're doing all those things which are really time-consuming and not very creative. And in that sense, it goes in your direction where you say, well, we should encourage, creativity. But if you're doing a lot of things, 80% of the work is like, doing things which are not so creative, and ChatGPT can help in reducing the time, then you have more time for creativity, which answers your objection in some sense. Wouldn't you agree?
Don't fill that out yet. What's on there?
I'm asking Peter.
So let me tell you a brief story. My thesis advisor in 1966, I think, published a paper in the Fall Joint Computer Conference, which was the big computer conference of the time, suggesting that the way to have computers understand English is to recognize that corresponding to every syntactic construct, there is a semantic construct.
Right.
Which is what you were suggesting. Nobody was able to make that work in those days. And now, of course, the technology and the vastly greater computational power of LLMs maybe is doing something like that. Yeah. So you may be onto something, but we still don't understand it. There's no good explanation other than a kind of hand-wavy one of how this might be plausible. Yeah. And so I'm just nervous about the verisimilitude of the things that these models are learning because they're not learning semantics, they're learning syntax.
Yeah, but the semantics is in the syntax. This is possible. If you look at the proximity of a prompt and the answer, it's a vector, and they project, it's a cosine. Actually, it's very simple. You just project the prompt semantics into the answer, and then the closer, the smaller the angle, this is how the ChatGPT chooses the answer. So in some sense, you're
unfortunately, sorry to cut you off. We are out of time for questions, and we're going to be moving into the closing remarks portion of this debate. So now we are slightly shortening it in the interest of time. So I'd like each speaker to give 1 minute of their closing thoughts. And then at the end of that, we'll have everyone fill out the poll and reveal the results to the audience. So let us start with Zach, and then Pete, 1 minute each of your closing thoughts.
So in closing, I do want to say this is not just a debate. I really think this is a policy pivot. And your vote actually could be influential in how education thinks about it. Because those people in Germany, in Humboldt, in the 18th century, dared to change the way academia worked. We not only have not moved on from the model, we've actually regressed from the German model. Here is our opportunity to think anew so that our students can be creative, can be unleashed to think fully, and not to be dragged down by strange bureaucratic stipulations that get in the way of an interaction with their knowledge, with their advisors, with the knowledge of humanity. And I want to repeat in closing, let's not confuse the state of the art with outstanding mentors. There are tens of thousands of students who are not getting that interaction and would immensely benefit from the interaction. I do not think this is a a merely academic point. It relates to our happiness collectively and to our workforce. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those kind remarks. And Pete, the floor is yours to close this debate.
Well, Zach, thank you very much for the compliments. I think I just want to reiterate that although these tools can be very helpful in thinking through what you've written, in trying to synthesize things that come from other places, I don't think that what you have in mind qualifies as having GPT write your thesis. It's something that I worry about turning over too much authority to an instrument that we don't understand very well, that doesn't know enough about what you actually have in mind that you want to convey, and that even if successful, doesn't provide one of the things that we find very important about graduate education, which is certifying that students are ready for an academic job or an industrial job or a medical job, where we use their ability to synthesize an experiment and describe it in a substantial way as the qualification that they need to do that. I should just end by pointing out that those 3 papers and every paper I've published is collaborative, and I owe a lot to my graduate students, former and present, and colleagues with whom we've written all these things, because I could never do that by myself.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank both speakers for a wonderful debate. And now I would invite the audience to fill out the poll scanned with the QR code, and the results will be released momentarily. All right, the results are in. I first want to thank both speakers for a very civil and passionate debate. I think politics can perhaps learn a little bit from this one. I think there are many complex questions asked, such as even considering what does it mean for GPT-4 to write a thesis? Does it mean to write it in its entirety, to generate ideas, or simply the writing portion in a way that can encourage people to reflect on that process in and of itself? I will begin by announcing the results pre the debate and then reveal the outcome. Before the debate, the audience voted 48% yes and 52% no to the motion, should GPT-4 write my thesis? After the debate, can we get a drum roll, please? There was a change. The audience voted 46% yes and 54% no. So that means our 4 debater has won this round. Congratulations.
It's probably within the margin of error.